Hey guys, how's it going? It's Baggins here, and today we're going to be talking tanking in New World post Brimstone Sands update. Now this tanking guide does focus on level 60, so endgame tanking. If you're newer to the game and you're working your way up and you want to learn some fundamentals of tanking in New World, I'll put a link to a video up in the top right. It's from quite a while ago, but it does cover all of the basics. In today's video, we're going to go over armor, gems, Heartrunes, weapon choices, mastery stats, and all that good stuff, and then also provide a few tips at the end of the video. Now for this video, we're going to be using a resource that I've created here. We'll put a link to the site in the description down below. You'll be able to find it there. We've got tier lists on here. We've got build guides for a variety of different builds as well. Of course, today we're going to be going over tanking. So we'll take a look at our little tank guide here. I will be putting a more in-depth version, so these are sort of just like some brief notes here, which are going to help me get through this video. But if you do want something a bit more in-depth, we also will have a guide up on New World Database as well. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning, this guide is just going to cover PvE, so player versus environment. We're not going to be looking at PvP with tanking, as I think it's still in a bit of a weird spot right now when it comes to tanks and PvP. They don't really have a solid purpose. If at some point in the future they do have that, I'll make sure to keep you guys posted. So as always, go ahead and subscribe if you want to see any future videos, stuff like a PvP tanking guide. But with that being said, let's start off with our weapon choice, shall we? So listed here are going to be some of the most standard loadouts you see for tanks in New World. That includes Sword and Shield Warhammer, which is probably the most common, Sword and Shield Hatchet, or now we have a new weapon that's just come into the game, the Greatsword, and I do think that will function well as a tanking weapon if you're a bit more aggressive. So if you have a solid healer and you're comfortable with them, you know they can keep you topped up, you could look to do Greatsword Warhammer or Greatsword Hatchet, and potentially even Greatsword Sword and Shield. I do think that a loadout like that might work, but the problem is I view Sword and Shield as sort of like a main weapon, and then the Greatsword is also like a main weapon as well, so you're like combining two primary weapons rather than a primary and a secondary, which is sort of how the Sword and Shield and Warhammer functions. You know, using the Sword and Shield for the majority of the stuff that you're trying to do in a dungeon or whatever, and then you switch to the Warhammer just to drop some stuns and abilities, and then you switch back again. Whereas both the Sword and Shield and Greatsword function like you want to have those in your hand most of the time. So that's why we're saying that we won't potentially pair those together, but if you want to, there's nothing stopping you, of course. But these are the weapon recommendations that I would go for. And stats wise, what we want to be looking at is either 300 strength, 200 constitution, or we're looking at 210 strength and 300 constitution. Now the main difference between these two builds is going to be how offensive and defensive you want to go. So obviously 300 plus strength at 200 constitution is going to allow you to do more damage, but you're going to have to be a bit more mindful of your health pool. However, it will give you access to this bonus here, basic attacks with a melee weapon gain grit, which is going to make it so that you can't be staggered or interrupted when you're attacking, which can be very, very useful if you've got big packs of enemies on you, as you're going to find yourself getting knocked around a lot. But if you're not feeling as confident, 200 strength, 300 constitution is also a solid build. One thing that's worth mentioning is some people get a bit confused about this. In order to reach these thresholds, you will need to use a food buff. So there are attribute food buffs that you can get in the game. Right now, here on the PTR, I have this one that increases strength by 40 for 40 minutes. We also have one that increases constitution by 40 for 40 minutes. However, a particular food that I would recommend for you is carrot cake. This increases both strength and constitution, but it's significantly cheaper than the roasted gnu fish or the rabbit with seasoned vegetables. So yeah, look for carrot cake on the trading post. That's probably going to be one of the cheaper foods you can get. Now when it comes to weapon mastery, we have a similar sort of choice as we do with the strength and constitution thresholds. We can opt to go for a more aggressive or more defensive option depending on how comfortable you're feeling as a tank. Right now what we have on the screen here is a more aggressive option, and again we do have this on the guide as well on New World Database and also on the Baggins TV resources website, so you can take a look through those in detail. But I thought we could quickly describe what would be the reasoning behind some of these passives and also the abilities as well. So Shield Rush, I think, is an incredibly good ability for the tank, and you pretty much always want to take this because it has Fortifying Shield Rush, which is a perk which goes with it, which gives you a hefty damage reduction. You can often get close to damage reduction cap, which is 50%, so a 50% fortify, by landing Shield Rush on a couple of enemies, provided you have the Fortifying Shield Rush perk on your shield, which right now we probably don't have. Oh, we actually do have it. Holy flip, look at that. So yeah, you can see after hitting a target with Shield Rush, gain Fortify, increasing damage absorption by 33%. And to my understanding, this can't stack. So yeah, if we just hit two enemies, we're already looking at the Fortify cap there. Some other choices, Defender's Resolve is going to be a no-brainer because this is our AoE taunt. You can see the down the bottom there. Taunt gem compatible. If you have a Carnelian gem equipped in your sword, this ability inflicts a taunt for 8 seconds to all enemies within 8 meters. This is one of the strongest taunts in the game, and we're pretty much always taking it. Because we have to skimp pretty light on the points over here, there are some things that we omit taking, like Restoration and also Defensive Training. This one in particular is very nice, but again, we have so much Fortify coming from the Fortifying Shield Rush and other things in our skill tree that we might not necessarily need it. Over on the left-hand side of the tree, the ability that we opted to go for was Reverse Stab, and that is because we have the Tactician passive over here, which reduces our cooldowns. And again, the more often we can use Shield Rush, the more we have Fortify, the more we can stay alive. And we can also pop taunts more often as well when we land this reverse stab on an enemy. Obviously, the leadership buff itself is nice for a more aggressive form of tanking. It just increases you and everyone in your group's damage by 10%. And most of the passives just speak for themselves. There is one choice you can make here. It is Confidence versus Free Injustice, so it's up to you whether you like one or the other more. Personally, I've gone for Confidence because, you know, if we can just stand in that sacred ground, we can deal a bunch of extra damage, but maybe you find that this is not going to be active too much for your particular group, in which case just taking Free Injustice to keep yourself a little bit more sustained in some more difficult mutations might be the way to go. Moving over to the Warhammer skill tree, this is going to stay relatively the same depending on whether you are aggressive or defensive. We're going to take Armor Breaker for a little bit of extra armor penetration and also some Rend. Rend is very, very important when it comes to group content, as it allows all of your team to do extra damage to the target, especially on a boss. This can be huge. We've got Shockwave because this is our taunt. It's also very good because it staggers, stuns, and also applies Rend with the Sundering Shockwave perk and a Weaken as well. So yeah, very, very strong AoE ability here. And lastly, we're going for Wrecking Ball just for a bit of extra CC. And again, we've got some more Fortify here just to keep ourselves alive. So yeah, 3 nice abilities here for the tank. I think there is some debate about whether to take like Mighty Gavel or maybe Path of Destiny, but these are going to be the abilities I recommend for you guys. We've opted to pick up Aftershock on the right-hand side of the skill tree. The extra slow can be handy with some other synergies, doing extra damage to enemies that are slowed and stuff. Also, most of the passives on the left-hand side of the tree here don't really benefit us that much as a tank, so we've just opted to take lots of passives over here and then pick up the ultimate because it's available. The Hatchet skill tree is going to stay the same whether you're playing aggressive or defensive here, so whether you're at 300 strength or 200 strength, we're going to use the same sort of skill tree here. Berserk is just a great ability to pop for the stagger immunity. This is obviously going to be much better if you don't have 300 strength. Defy Death just stops us from dying, which, you know, can be very handy if we're going to die. Raging Torrent can be really, really good with the refreshing Raging Torrent, as it lowers all your other cooldowns by a good chunk. And then we've got Rending Throw, again, because applying Rend to the enemy can be very beneficial to our team. The last skill tree to look at here is the Greatsword, and then we're going to look at what a defensive sort of style of sword and shield build would look like. My 3 favorite abilities that I've seen on the Greatsword so far are Crosscut, Calamity Counter, and Roaring Rupture. Roaring Rupture is our taunt, so we kind of have to take this, even though it isn't that good. It's got Fortify, and it, you know, it does some okay damage, but in general, I do think there are some better abilities over here. Calamity Counter feels like it's a no-brainer for a tank. It basically just gives you 2 seconds of taking no damage, which can, you know, help your healer catch up, and then you can also knock the enemies back if you get the 3 hits, which is pretty much always going to happen in PvE. And it has Grit as well. It's a pretty nuts ability. The Bleed on this also has some synergy with your Heartrune, but we'll talk about that a bit later on in the video. And then finally, Leech and Crosscut. I just find this ability to hit really hard. It's going to be good to generate threat, and also the Leeching Crosscut perk, which goes with this, gives you a massive amount of sustain. I've opted to take the ultimate on the Defiant side of the tree just for a little bit of extra sustain, but if you guys were feeling really aggressive, you could maybe go ahead and take the other ultimate over here for some extra cooldown reduction. However, this is bearing in mind that the Greatsword would be your main tanking weapon, so you wouldn't be using this with Sword and Shield. Like, this would be the tanking weapon, so you probably want to have a little bit of defense over here, in my opinion. So now we have the skill mastery tree for a more defensive orientated tank with the Sword and Shield, of course, and the main difference you can see here is we now have defensive formation over here on the right, and we're not taking leadership anymore. In order to do that, we've dropped a few passives over on the left hand side of the tree. We've picked up some nicer passives like the defensive training that we wanted to get, and also the restoration on the right side of the tree. Other than that, it remains relatively the same, just again, you know, no leadership, but some more damage reduction from defensive formation. The only thing that would change on a Warhammer skill tree if you're playing a more defensive build is you would opt to take away power through pain and instead go and take hardened steel. This is because if you're running 200 strength instead of 300 strength, you no longer have the grit on your attacks, but this gives you grit on your Warhammer heavy attacks. The next section we're going to move on to is perks and gear. There is quite a lot to talk about here, but we will try and get through this to make this video not too long. Again, links to the guides in the description down below. So in this next part of the video, we're going to talk about perks and gear. So your armor, your jewelry, your weapons, and also what perks do you want to see in them. Before we do that, we should mention equip loads. Now, I think that most people probably understand this being a tank, but you generally want to be in heavy armor. That's going to give you a lot of benefits as a heavy user. One of the biggest ones you can see is the block stability. It gives you 15% increase on your block stability. Also, your crowd control debuff, so your stuns and stuff last longer. And then on top of that, you just get a ton of armor as well, so you're more tanky and you can take more hits. One thing that we mentioned here in the guide is light armor. You are going to see some light armor tanks out there. They wear full light, like every single piece of gear is light armor, and they have a round shield. However, this is only really used for speed runs, and very, very confident tanks. So for this build, we are just going to be talking about heavy armor. So the next thing we have to talk about is perks, weapon perks, and perks that you can get on your armor and on your jewelry. These can make a very big difference to how effective you're going to be as a tank. And the first thing that we'll talk about, as covered in the guide, are the perks for your sword, your greatsword, warhammer, hatchet, tower shield, so on and so forth. So rather than go too in-depth and list off every single perk, we're just going to show what's on the screen here. And if I think a perk needs further explanation, I'll explain it to you guys. So with the sword, we've gone for Refreshing Move, Thwarting Strikes, and Bane perks. So that includes Angry Earth Bane, Corrupted Bane, Lost Bane, yeah, that's the one, Ancient Bane, so on and so forth, and that's going to be relevant for which dungeon you're doing. So if you're doing Lazarus Instrumentality, you want Ancient Bane. If you're doing Garden of Genesis, you want Angry Earth Bane. However, if you do just want a one-size-fits-all, you could replace the Bane perks with Keenly Empowered, but you would be losing out on quite a bit of extra damage and, as a result, extra threat. Refreshing Move is there just to lower our cooldowns. Every time we land a light or heavy attack, we'll get cooldown reduction, and Thwarting Strikes can be swapped in and out depending on whether you have 300 strength or not, as this allows you to do extra damage when you have grit, which is what 300 strength gives you. You can see the same sort of thing with the greatsword, and it's the same sort of explanation. Trenchant Strikes might be an option instead of Enchanted, so if you're under 300 strength, you won't have that grit, so Enchanted or Trenchant Strikes, but probably just Enchanted with the normal sword. On the Warhammer, I think Sundering Shockwave is a must-have perk. This is going to apply Rend to all the targets you hit with Shockwave, making them take more damage, which is just huge. It's going to be really, really good to support your team. And then any combination of what we've listed here, generally for the previous reasons that we see with the greatsword and the sword. Hatchet, the must-have perk in my opinion, is Refreshing Torrent. A lot of sort of M10, M11 speedrunners will tell you this as well. It just gives you a tremendous amount of cooldown reduction. Every single hit that you land with the Torrent ability lowers all the cooldowns of the Hatchet, which can be huge. And then we're going to take pretty much the same sort of similar perks that we see with the greatsword, the Warhammer, and the sword. Now with the Tower Shield, this is where things get very specific. You want to be looking for Fortifying Shield Rush, Sturdy, and Sturdy Energy. However, if you do have the Sturdy Energy perk on your chest, then you could swap it out for Refreshing, Hated, or one of the Ward perks, again, Angry Earth Ward, Corrupted Ward, and so on and so forth. There is also Legendary Tower Shields. I think these are going to be more accessible during the Brimstone Sands and onwards. And if you do have a Legendary Tower Shield, again, we're looking for the combination of the same three perks we got with the Epic, and then we can go for Hated, Refreshing, or maybe one of the Shield Ward perks as well. So like Nature Shield Ward, Frost Shield Ward, and this is for Mutated Expeditions. Moving on over to the perks on your armor, these can also make a pretty big difference. We can see we got some nice ones here. Elemental Aversion, Freedom, kind of okay. Resilient, not going to be good for PvE though. So what are the ideals? What do we want to be looking for? Well, we've got the Ward perks. So again, that's Corrupted Ward, Angry Earth Ward, depends what dungeon you're going into. You are probably going to end up getting multiple different sets in order to meet this criteria. But if you did want to do a one-size-fits-all, you could just take a combination of these like perks over here. And then moving on to the jewelry, I think Divine and Health can be a good basis. So health, it's just going to increase the amount of health you have, which is great for tanks and also pretty good for every other role as well. Stamina Recovery can be a nice perk. We talked about Divine, that is extra incoming healing, which can also be great for a tank. Fortified can also be a good one as well, increases the duration of Fortify on you, or any of the protection perks. In particular for Mutated Expeditions, this is going to be a real good move to do. For me, I like to get a amulet that has a Void gem in, so an Amethyst gem in the amulet, and then also has the Void protection perk, so it sort of doubles up, and I can just slap that amulet on when I'm doing Void mutations, and I've got 16% extra Void damage absorption there. On the ring, there's really only one mandatory perk, and that is Hearty. You're going to see a lot of rings out there with Hearty on them. They're used for pretty much like all builds out there these days because they give you extra stamina, which can be very useful because instead of having 2 dodges and then you're out of stamina, you could see that I could do a third one there. We'd have a third one in the tank, and it's also very useful for blocking as well because having more stamina means we can block for longer. Other perks that are good to pick up on the ring include Enfeebling to increase the weaken duration. There is quite a few weapons that apply weaken, and also your Heartrune, which we'll talk about later. Slash damage, which is going to benefit the sword and the greatsword. Leeching for extra sustain, lifesteal, or Keen and Refreshing just for a little bit of extra damage and ability uptime. And then on the earring, we want to be looking for Refreshing Toast so we can pop potions more often. Again, I believe on my PTR character here, we've got a somewhat okay earring. That's not an earring. Here we go. Refreshing Toast, Nimble, and Purifying Toast. Yeah, so not the best combination of perks here. My dream amulet would be Refreshing Toast, Healthy Toast, and Refreshing, which is actually what I have on my my main character. A little bit of a brag there. But again, any combination of these perks could be pretty good for an earring as well. One other thing that I want to cover with the perks category is the ability perks. So this is stuff like the Fortifying Shield Rush, the Hatchets, Refreshing Torrent, Sundering Shockwave for the Warhammer. I think these particular perks, you do want to make sure that you get them on the weapon. Now, the reason why we want to get these perks on our weapons is because they become much more powerful, actually. So I don't really have an example here, but the Empowering Leaping Strike attacks deal 31% additional damage. This would be a weaker percentage, so it maybe only be like 19 or 15% additional damage if it was on my armor. So with the really big power perks like the Sundering Shockwave, the Refreshing Torrent, and the Fortifying Shield Rush, you want to make sure you get those on the weapon that they are for. However, there are a few other perks that you also want to pick up, but again, these can just be gotten on your armor if you are using the relevant weapons. So Penetrating Wrecking Ball for the Warhammer, Reverse Stab and Accelerated Resolve for the sword and shield, and then Leeching Crosscut and Energizing Counter if you're using the Greatsword. You don't need these on the weapons. I think maybe the 2 Greatsword perks could be okay on the Greatsword, but yeah, these are like some perks that you definitely want to make sure you have in your build if you're using the relevant weapon. Now, you might be saying at this point in the video, well, Baggins, that's all fine and well listing off these amazing perks and saying that you need to get this and this and this and this, but how am I actually going to go ahead and get my hands on those? Am I going to have to spend billions of gold on the trading post? Well, this is the part of the video that you're going to be relieved to see. We've actually done our research and looked at some weapons that you can get as drops. So a lot of these have the criteria that we previously listed in the perks and gear section, so they've got a good selection of these perks that we mentioned. And rather than like go through and look at each individual one, I'm just going to show them here on the screen. And again, you'll be able to click the link in the description down below, or go to the New World database version of it, and you'll actually be able to click on the links. You'll be able to go through in fact, let's just do a live demo here rather than explain how that works. So for instance, one of the swords that we listed was Guardian's Resolve. So if we just search for the name Guardian's Resolve here in New World database, we can click on the item, we can see where it drops, what it has on it. So Refreshing Move, Corrupted Bane, and Thwarting Strikes. This is going to be a great sword. Well, it's going to be a great sword to have with it's not actually a great sword. Stop it, Baggins. If we click on the enemy here, you can see whereabouts on the map they are, and then you can go ahead and farm this guy over and over again. It's obviously got quite a few drops in here, 768 possible drops, but if you're persistent, you might end up getting this sword for yourself, and this is going to be a great sword. This is going to be a good sword to run in Corrupted Expeditions. Along with the sword, we've also listed great swords, warhammers, hatchets, tower shields, armor, amulets, rings, and earrings that you can all find as well, with a pretty good combination of perks. So again, you can just go to New World Database to search for these items, or go to the New World Database version of the guide, and then you'll be able to click or tap on each one and go and learn where its location is, and then you can try and farm for it, which is going to give you a pretty decent set of tanking gear if you can acquire all of these. Now, the last piece of gearing that we have to talk about when it comes to tanks are Heartrunes and Gems. Heartrunes obviously being one of the brand new items that we've got coming with the Brimstone Sands expansion, and in particular, I think there are 3 ones that look really good, in my opinion, for tanking. That is the Brutal Heartrune of Dark Ascent. Obviously, there's going to be the Epic and just the normal, like the blue versions of these, which I guess are rare, but we're going to talk about the Legendary as like the ultimate goal to aim for. We also have the Stalwart Heartrune of Stoneform and the Brutal Heartrune of Grasping Vines. Now, I think any of these could be used, and they would make you, like, they wouldn't hurt you as a tank, they'd all improve your playstyle, but it kind of just depends what you want to go for. So I think if you are using 300 plus strength, so if you have the 300 strength variant of tanking, then you probably want to take either the Brutal Heartrune of Dark Ascent. This is just going to give you a big chunk of lifesteal. It does 2k damage, as you can see here, but also another 50% on top of that, 150% Heartrune damage. So I guess we're looking at 3,000 damage there, quick maths, and also heals for 100% of the damage done. And I believe this is on multiple enemies, so you're looking at a pretty massive heal you can pop off there in a crowd of enemies to top yourself back up. And then we've also got the Grasping Vines rune here as well. This one in particular applies Rend and Weaken, which is going to be very useful for your team. So this is if you're a bit more of a support-orientated tank. You're going to reduce the target's damage absorption by 20%, so they take 20% more damage for 5 seconds. And you're also going to reduce the damage they do to you and your party by 20% for 8 seconds. And along with that, you're going to do a fairly decent amount of damage and also root them to the ground. So yeah, very powerful ability here. One thing you do have to bear in mind though is it does reduce your stamina regeneration by 50%. So when you pop it, you do want to make sure that you've got like your Defender's Resolve or something ready to go as well, just so you can take it a little bit less damage, because you don't really want to be sitting there with your shield up, because they're going to blow through your stamina and you're not going to be recovering it as fast due to that reduced stamina regeneration. The other option I listed is the Stone Form rune. This one gives you more damage absorption and also gives you a pretty decent heal. This is going to be increased when you're standing in Sacred Ground, but the most powerful thing is it makes you immune to stagger and crowd control debuffs for 5 seconds. Now, if you've got the 300 strength, every time you attack, you're just going to get grit, so you won't be able to get interrupted anyway. But if you are running the 200 strength, 300 constitution variant, you might find it useful to have the Stone Form rune, because this is going to make it so that you can't get interrupted. So if you do a big pull on a large pack of enemies and then they're just knocking you around left, right, and center, this is going to allow you to stabilize and then drop that shockwave and get the fight under control. Now moving on to gems, and this is a really important thing when it comes to tanking. This is the Cut Pristine Carnelian gem. Now there is a bunch of different variants of this at lower tiers, but you want to be using the max tier when you're level 60, and that's because it has this ability here. Taunts are active and you generate 300% more threat. You want to always make sure you have one of these in your weapon, otherwise your taunts are not going to be active, and it's going to heavily impact your ability to tank as a result of that. Now we do also have the Runeglass versions of the Carnelian as well. We're going to talk about this a little bit further on, but I wanted to cover armor gems first. So when it comes to gems in your armor, I think you have two approaches to this. You're either doing normal expeditions, so you're just doing the standard version of Lazarus, Genesis, the Ennead, Tempest Heart, Barnacles and Black Powder, etc. And if that's the case, most of the damage you're going to be taking is going to be physical. So I think slotting a few Onyx gems for the physical damage absorption is a good idea, or even going for a few diamonds because they give you physical, but also a little bit of elemental to cover you, because there are going to be some enemies that do elemental damage, but in normal expeditions, most of the damage you're going to take is going to be physical. Now, one thing that I do want to bring your attention to as well is this breakdown of numbers here, so you can see my physical and elemental damage absorption that we've got here, and also the specific resistances that we're getting. So we're getting a little bit more slash damage resistance than we are getting elemental damage resistance right now across the board, apart from fire, because we've got these 2 rubies. And I think in an ideal world, you kind of want to keep this pretty balanced. You don't want to be weak to one particular type of damage, unless maybe it's arcane. You know, there's not really that many enemies currently doing arcane damage out there. But as a general rule of thumb, keeping these numbers somewhat similar, skewing a bit more for physical in normal expeditions, but on the opposite side, going much more towards elemental for mutated expeditions. Now, one thing you're going to be doing as you become a bit more of an advanced tank is going into mutated expeditions, and the mutated expeditions have specific elements that you will face. So fire, frost, nature, and void at time of recording. We're probably going to see lightning and stuff in the future, but with those, you want to make sure that you spec into that particular element just a little bit. So you can see with my legs and my boots, I've opted to go for 2 rubies here for the fire damage absorption. And then in my gloves and my chest piece, we've also taken some opal gems as well. Now we do have the Runeglass versions, but if we just go ahead and swap those out because we're on the PTR and it doesn't really mean too much, I think this is the sort of setup that I would look for in a mutated expedition. So we go 3 opal gems and then 2 either fire, nature, frost gems, depending on what you're going against. I think this is going to be like the ideal setup, and this covers you against most elemental, and then you've got 2 down here for the specific thing that you're going against that week. Now, a good chunk of the time, the jewelry you will be running will be crafted, so you don't really have to worry about this because we can't swap out. This is diamond jewelry here, so it's always going to be diamond. But if you do find that you have jewelry that you can swap the gems out on, then again, maybe taking a few more opals would be a good idea here, just to cover you against a broad range of elements. Now, the next thing we have to talk about with gems is the Runeglass versions. Now, these are a bit of a pain in the butt for tanks because you'll notice here when we look at the Carnelian gem, for example, we talked about previously, taunts are active and you generate 300% more threat, but then we have this Runeglass version. You generate 250% more threat. Also, it should say taunts are active, but I guess it would just be too much text. So yeah, we lose 50% threat, but we gain extra effects here. So we can get stamina on each successful hit. We can also get lifesteal. We can have our melee attacks do extra damage, and a bunch of other things as well. I think in general, taking the stamina runes is going to be the best play for a tank. Obviously, you guys, as you get more comfortable, will find out what works for you, but stamina is a major resource of, like tanking and staying alive because it allows us to block and also potentially dodge if we're going to take some big damage as well. In the case of the Greatsword, it can also be used for doing the heavy attacks. If you're in onslaught mode, your heavy attacks are going to cost stamina as well. So we might want to look to take some energizing Runeglass gems if we are interested in going down that route, but I do think there is no shame in just keeping your standard gems for now because the benefit isn't that huge and it does take away from some of our threat and our weapons. One thing that I will say when it comes to your armor is that unless you're very comfortable, I would probably just keep 2 as non-Runeglass variants. So these 2 fire gems here, I would keep them just as the fire gems, and then we'd swap those out week after week, and we would go ahead and replace the opals because we know the opals are going to stay consistent with this piece of gear. We don't need to be swapping those out each week. So this is probably what my setup would look like. And then, as I say, if we were going into a void mutation, we just take a couple of amethyst gems and swap out the bottom 2 here, but we don't really want to be swapping out Runeglass every single week because that's going to get pretty expensive, at least at the start of the expansion anyway. Now, the gems are obviously a bit of a nuanced thing, so maybe you guys will find something that works better for you. Hopefully I was able to explain that in somewhat of a meaningful way. To recap, it's going to be mainly physical damage, so onyx gems, diamond gems, maybe a few malachite just for the other way around for your normal expeditions, and then when you move into mutated expeditions, go for about 3 Runeglass opals in your armor, and then the other 2 are going to be relevant for the particular mutated expedition you're going in. So again, fire, frost, nature, and so on and so forth. In your weapons, you have the choice to lose a little bit of threat and gain the extra stamina or lifesteal, and that's going to come down to your personal preference, but always want to make sure that you do have a Carnelian in your weapons. Now, the last thing we have to talk about are just some general tips when it comes to tanking. You can see these on the screen here, and we won't cover every single one, but some of the most important ones that I think, and if you've tanked in other MMOs before, these are going to sound fairly familiar. But if we imagine that Cynical B here was like an Angry Earth or a Skeleton or a Corrupted or something, and he's a melee dude, so we go in and hit him, we get his attention, and then we pull the melee guy over to Salvatore here, who is an archer, then we can stack them up together, and this allows our DPS to be able to hit the archers and also hit the melee at the same time, and allows you to just better manage the aggro of all of the enemies around you as well. What you'll see some tanks doing is just like they'll go in, they'll hit the archer first just to get a little bit of aggro, and then they'll run over to this guy, hit him and get aggro, and then they'll do a taunt, and then they'll just stay here. But the problem is that archer is very quickly going to lose aggro of you and start shooting your healer instead. So whenever possible, try and get the melee and then pull them over to the archers so you can group them all up, and your DPS will thank you for it. Another thing to do, it's pretty standard tanking procedure in most MMOs, is just to keep the enemy faced away from your team. So this, if Salvatore was one of my DPS players here, he's got like Hatchet and Great Axe or something, I would be standing like this, keeping the enemy faced away from my team, and that allows your team to hit them in the back and they can get the rogue effect, so that's critical backstabs, and it also prevents your team from taking any potential cleaving damage. So if this was like an enemy here and we were doing that, everybody that was in front would be getting hit by the attack, but if we're facing them away from our team, then everybody's nice and safe behind the enemy. We've got quite a few other tips and tricks when it comes to tanking here as well, but again, I don't want this video to go for too long, so make sure you check out the guide in the description down below if you're interested. I want to say a big thank you to Jules, that's Jools, on the Barry server for giving us a good amount of advice and guidance when it comes to making this tank guide, as I'm not the best tank player myself, but where I could, we tried to consult with Jules, who is a tank with many hours of experience in New World. As always, guys, if you enjoy these videos, you want to see more, we're going to have future guides coming out, like healer guides, mage guides, bruiser, and ranger, running over the same sort of thing, but in both PvE and PvP. So if you do want to see those, make sure you go ahead and subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you guys all in the next one.